right, hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we are sitting down with a brand new guest talking about some brand new things. His name is Eric Reitan. He's an author, he's a philosophy professor. And so Eric, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to have this time with you.
Well, I'm excited to be here. Thanks.
Absolutely. So I don't really have any kind of agenda for this conversation. Usually I have some kind of topic I want to dig into, but I started reading your latest book, so Eden Sank to Grief. And like I said earlier before we hit record, I'm about halfway through, three-quarters through. And for our listeners, it's a powerful fiction story. It addresses a number of, I would say, massively important social issues. And so, although I'm sure the book is going to come up at some point in our conversation, what I'm most interested in talking to you about, Eric, is your story. Because in your email that you wrote to me, you said that you became a philosopher because it gave you these resources to think more clearly about questions that were important to you, in particular, or including questions about your Christian faith. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your faith journey. Like, what were you taught growing up? You know, when did questions start to
Mhm.
arise? Philosophy, how did that find its way into the story? How has it helped you with these questions? Where is your faith today? So take us on the journey. I've got my coffee. It's 9:30
Okay.
here. I got my coffee. I'm ready for wherever you're going to take us.
All right. So yeah, um, I was raised. My parents were both preachers' kids.
Hmm.
Uh, my uh, my mother was a Baptist preacher's kid, and my father was a Lutheran preacher's kid.
Hmm.
Um, and both in their own distinct ways, um, both. Uh, Rejected their faith traditions and were influenced by it, and I was in turn influenced by this combination of well, my father was an agnostic
Hmm.
uh, scientist. um, my mother, I would say, the closest thing, and I discovered this later in life, to her faith uh, is John Hick's pluralism.
Hmm.
Um, if that means anything to you, the
Tell me more
philosopher.
about that, what that means.
Yeah. So John Hick, his journey is not that different from my mother's in many ways, except I mean, he was an intellectual who wrote about what happened to him, and my mother never did. Um, but let me tell you just a little bit about my mother's story, and then connect it with Hick. So my mother grew up, as I said, a Baptist preacher's kid, but in Scandinavia,
Hmm.
in Norway and Denmark, and briefly in Sweden. As you probably know, Scandinavia is Lutheran country, so the Baptist community was tiny.
Hmm.
So it was this very insular religious community in which everyone knew what everyone else was doing in that community. And my mother felt the weight of that as the eldest child of the preacher,
Hmm.
to be, a perfect representative of the faith and all of this. Um, and she um, well, she described it later as, I would have stuff shoved down my throat, I'd vomit it up, and then they'd scoop up the vomit and shove it down my throat.
Wow.
Uh,
Hmm.
that was her subjective experience of a lot
Yeah.
of what she was receiving.
Hmm.
Um, but it was a very insular world until um, my grandfather got the idea from a visiting evangelist from California, that he needed to move the family to California to become part of the Great Awakening that was about to happen
Hmm.
there. This was in the 1950s, and they were stuck in Denmark during the occupation, the World War II, uh, the German occupation. Um, and my grandfather at the time became part of the resistance movement.
Hmm.
So he was a very dynamic person, very courageous, He didn't think twice about moving to this new country. My mother was in her early 20s at the time, and she was about to start a music conservatory uh,
Mm.
i- in Scandinavia. Um, but the family was like, "You've got to come with us, right? This is a family." So she gave up her plans and moved with the family uh, to the Bay Area. And in some ways, that is a good thing that happened because with his very limited English, he did not become uh, wasn't able to get a job right away in the ministry.
Sure.
That took some time. He did eventually get a job at the Norwegian Seamen's Mission in
Mm.
San Francisco. But until that happened, my mother basically supported the family uh, giving piano lessons. Um, but that's important to her journey because when they moved to the Bay Area in the 50s, she became the breadwinner going from home to home, teaching piano lessons.
Wow.
Um,
Mm.
and uh, I just we just had the funeral for my mother this past weekend,
Oh, I'm so
and
sorry. Mm.
I told the story of when I learned that she was the first piano teacher for Brent Midland, who was the longest running keyboardist for the Grateful Dead. She didn't realize the significance of this because she lived totally in classical music,
Mm.
and um, but that gives you a sense of, this was a vibrant time of change in
Yeah,
California,
yeah, yeah.
and she was getting in contact with all kinds of different people, um, and getting in contact with people of different faiths.
Wow.
Um, and and what really hit her at that uh, in that time was this idea: if I had been raised Jewish, I would be Jewish today. If
Mhm.
I had been raised
Mm.
Hindu, I would be Hindu today. Right? And she met people,
Yeah.
Jews and Hindus, for the first time. Right? Um, uh, and and that led her to seriously question what she had learned about um, salvation, right? That
Yeah.
salvation depended on an explicit embrace of Jesus Christ as personal Lord and Savior. And she was imagining what that sounded like from the outside for the first time, really.
Mm.
And and it just didn't make any sense to her. And so she gravitated towards this idea that God was beyond our understanding, that these different religions were different attempts to grasp in human conceptual terms and human stories the nature of this divine that transcended all our categories.
Yeah.
Um, and
Mm.
that's very much Hickean pluralism,
Okay.
right? That there's this parable my mother loved, that uh, I think is a Hindu parable about the blind men and the elephant. You may have heard it, but that very much captures her perspective as well.
Yeah.
Um, right, these uh, 3 or 4 blind men, or sometimes I've seen 5,
Mm.
um, are all trying to connect or describe an elephant when they come in contact with it. And the one blind man is touching the elephant's side and says, "Well, it's like a wall,"
Mm.
right? And another has got a hold of, I don't know why the elephant is putting up with this, but it's got a hold of
Right. Stomp on them.
of the leg, right? And saying, "Oh, no, 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 an elephant is like a tree trunk," and another has got a hold of the elephant's trunk and say, "No, it's like a snake," right? And that
Mm.
sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, so her idea is that in relation to God, human beings are like this.
Mhm.
Um, now, I give you this. I have, uh, because I grew up as I did, a fair bit of sympathy for this perspective, but I also was critical of it in my own faith journey.
Hmm.
Um, in part because I saw where it took my mother, which was um, to a place where she was appreciating the rainbow, right, of different faiths. Um, but uh, if everyone was like her, there would be no rainbow.
Mm.
Um,
I
and
never thought of that. That's interesting. Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
right, because um, she did not embody a perspective or a tradition, right?
Yeah.
So she was um, jarred out of her perspective or tradition, and never for the rest of her life embodied a perspective or tradition, a
Mm.
way of seeing God, a
Mm.
way of connecting with God, a way of relating to God. Um, and um, I um, um, and I don't know, at least with my parents' examples, I don't know if it is possible to find a way of relating to God that is totally vague, right?
Mhm.
That is outside of any particular uh, band of the rainbow.
Mhm.
I think it is very possible to um, inhabit, if you will, one band of the rainbow,
Mhm.
um, but recognize the value of the other bands of the rainbow,
Mm.
and inhabit that band of the rainbow in ways that uh, uh, acknowledge that um, inhabiting that band offers a perspective, a way of seeing that is necessarily incomplete.
Yeah.
Um, so
Mm.
I think so I gravitated
Mm.
more towards something like that, but it took me um, first on a journey in which I explored something more like um, what my parents both rejected.
Mm.
Right? I
Mm.
when I got to college, um, well, interestingly, you asked about my, philosopher side.
Mhm.
I I came to really believe in God. Um, my freshman year in college, sitting alone in the stacks of the library, reading philosophy.
Mm.
Um, I've since encountered people who think of philosophy as an enemy of faith.
Mhm.
That reason versus faith. Philosophy
It's
is
gonna take you away from God.
rationality, right?
Right. Yeah.
And and that is so at odds with my experience, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's the polar opposite of my experience. That I don't need to be convinced that that's a mistaken way of seeing it,
Mhm.
right? Because um, I was wrestling with these big ideas. Why is there something and not nothing? Um, Alone in the stacks with great philosophers, and it was in engaging with those kinds of questions that um, I became convinced that um, the empirical world was just the skin, the surface of something much vaster
Yeah.
that I
Mm.
wanted to connect with.
Mm.
Um, and uh, and my first forays into connecting with that didn't really stick because I had this friend who was like, "Come with me to Friday night basic meeting." Uh, Basic brothers and sisters in Christ.
Mm.
And I don't know what that organization, if it even exists today,
Mm.
was like elsewhere. But at the university where I was, it was um, um, eh, the leaders came from this particular um, Pentecostal church, um, where speaking in tongues was very important.
Yeah.
Um, and uh, so it was, yeah, very charismatic. And I found it interesting, but I never felt at home in it.
Mhm.
Um, and I mean, when stood in the midst of all these people speaking in tongues, and then one of the leaders translating what everyone was saying, none of the people who were speaking in tongues, of course, understood what they were saying, but the
The
leader did.
interpreter did, yeah.
Yeah, the interpreter did. Um, uh, and what they were saying, uh, what it sounded like, there were people next to me. All I heard was ticka 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 ticka, right? Uh, right. It just sounded to me like they were making random sounds.
Yeah.
So, but um, but I got far enough into it that they convinced me to go to their Sunday service,
Mhm.
and um, during that service, the preacher said, "There's someone here who's halfway, right, has their foot partway into the faith and partway outside of it," uh, and it sounded like they were describing me, and said,
Mhm.
"Would that person come forward?" So I came forward, and in the grip of this person's charisma and energy, I was speaking in tongues
Mhm.
in short order, and it was not just ticka 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 ticka. It was, and I was shaking, and I had no idea what I was saying, and it was probably just gibberish,
Mhm.
but it had the shape of language, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
More of the shape of language
Sure.
than a lot of what I heard. Um, Now, in the aftermath of that, my thought, maybe I inherited some of my father, was that's a really interesting manifestation of my subconscious when when I allowed myself, in effect, to be hypnotized, right,
Yeah.
by a powerful
I love
charismatic
that that's how
figure.
your brain was processing. Yeah, yeah. You're, like, analyzing it while you're having this experience,
Right?
right?
Whereas the people who had taken me there thought this is the moment that he is now
Right.
part of us and is right,
The
right,
spirit has fallen on him, right?
right. Spirit is descended on. But I mean, those are two distinct ways of seeing, right?
Yep.
The
Yep.
same phenomenon. And
Yep.
as a philosopher, I'm very interested in ways of seeing, right?
Mhm.
And the way of seeing that I came to adopt towards that experience was akin to the way of seeing of more secular perspective,
Mhm.
than the way of seeing uh, that the leaders of the basic group uh, adopted. Um, that said, when I immersed myself more deeply in philosophy, I found religious ways of seeing reality as a
Mm.
whole,
Mm.
in all its richness and diversity, much more satisfying than purely secular or materialistic ways of seeing
Mhm.
it. Um, the the way I would describe it is that um uh, the non-religious ways of seeing the whole of reality requires you to explain away a lot,
Mm.
right? As just a side effect, right?
Yeah.
Uh, Take, for example, something that was very important to me growing up. And still to this day, music.
Mm.
Right, I played the violin my whole life,
Mm.
and when I'm making music, when I'm really in tune to beauty,
Mhm.
uh, it feels like I am in touch with something deeply true about reality that cannot be captured in words, right?
Mm.
It's what it feels like, right?
Yep.
When I'm truly in the moment, uh, making music, or listening to great music, I feel like I'm connecting to a dimension of reality. It feels more than just
Yep.
a a weird side effect of evolutionary processes that serves no adaptive advantage, but is a kind of uh, dimension of our brains, right?
Yep.
That
Yep.
that just is doing its thing, but it's not connecting us with truth or anything, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, there's a sense in which a religious worldview you might be able to explain rather than simply explain away these dimensions of our experience.
Mm.
Um, and um, and I was, asking as a philosopher the question: do I really need to explain away? Is the worldview that explains these things away really better grounded in the evidence than a worldview that explains?
Yeah.
Um,
Mm.
if that makes sense.
Yep.
And at least my answer was no, right? In part because um, a worldview that requires me to explain away is basically treating elements of my experience as if they have no evidentiary
Yep.
value.
Mm.
And so that really touches, deep philosophical questions of like what counts as evidence and why does it count as evidence.
Mhm.
Um, and in fact, in this, you mentioned "So Eden Sank to Grief," my
Mhm.
novel. That's one of the themes, right?
Yep.
That I'm trying to explore in there. Um, uh, it that the novel was born out of um, a little blog post I created, a just little parable, 2 page. Uh, I called it "The Parable of the Spaceship."
Mm.
Um, and I also intended not just for my blog audience at the time, but for my philosophy of religion students. Um, and the parable was a bunch of people waking up um, uh, in this spaceship with no memory how they got there. Um, some of them have visions, some of them don't.
Mhm.
Some of them interpret the visions in one way, some of them interpret the visions in another way. And uh, the visions are of a scorched earth, uh, but some people interpret that to mean they've been rescued by benevolent aliens in the wake of the Earth's destruction. Others take it to mean they've been kidnapped by malevolent aliens
Mhm.
who destroyed the planet. And the people who haven't had visions, some of them dismiss the visionaries, right, as just hallucinating, and there's absolutely no evidentiary value in what they are experiencing. It's just their neural misfirings in their brain,
Mhm.
uh, and um, and so the that parable was really intended to sort of ask, well, what counts as evidence and why? What are we warranted in believing in the midst of uncertainty, and on what basis? Right? Am I justified if I have these visions in treating them as having some evidentiary value? Um, but also, given that there these experiences are susceptible to different interpretations and
Mhm.
susceptible to being explained away as some kind of traumatic side effect of the experience I'm having of waking up in this alien place,
Mhm.
right? Given those things, um, how much confidence should I place in any uh, uh, perspective or worldview that I build based on these things? And I mean, I lean towards the idea that yes, I can treat these distinctive experiences as having evidentiary value. I don't have to treat them
Mhm.
as evidentially inert, right? But I also have to be conscious of my fallibility,
Mhm.
the fact that every not only is everything that I experience subject to interpretation through a lens, but what I treat as evidence is a function of a certain lens.
Mhm.
And I need to be aware of that, right? I need to be conscious of that as I um, form my beliefs. And uh, the way that I express that consciousness is with a certain humility relative to my beliefs, a recognition of my fallibility, and an openness to being moved by alternative perspectives.
Mm.
Right.
Wow. Mm.
So, uh, but anyway, the parable that I wrote was intended to sort of probe these questions.
Yeah.
Um, but when I looked at it, one of the things I saw was that this parable had Lost vibes, like the TV show Lost.
Yeah.
Uh, that there
That's
were
what I was thinking when you were talking.
right, there were uh, these people with different uh, uh, interpretations who came up or who formed different camps, right?
Yep.
Who
Yep.
got into conflict, right? And the people find themselves in a strange place, no idea how they got there, no idea what's really going on,
Yep.
um, and there is comfort in certainty, in ignoring everything I just said, right?
Yep.
About fallibilism, about
Yep.
and saying this is what's going on, this is what we need to do.
Yep.
And so you have different people who are you have reach different conclusions. This is what's going on. This is what we need to do,
Yep.
and the result of that, of course, is conflict, right?
Yeah.
And not necessarily healthy conflict.
Mhm.
Um, and one of the things that has long been of interest to me as a philosopher is uh, philosophy of conflict, conflict resolution, violence, and nonviolence.
Mm.
And so as I started developing that parable, I it became more than just about what are we justified in believing in the midst of uncertainty, but how do we handle the conflicts that arise given the inevitable differences in
Yeah.
our interpretations of our world,
Mm.
right? And so that became a major theme as well. But anyway, um, that so in so many ways, this novel is really a kind of different way of addressing the philosophical ideas that have long been central to my own life journey and my philosophical work. Um, and getting back to that journey, I in college sort of toyed with more evangelical,
Mhm.
uh, charismatic expression of Christianity, then gravitated much more to a Lutheran version. Um, but in grad school, what really shaped the trajectory of my faith journey, um, interestingly, was a course on Hegel.
Mm.
Uh, and Hegel, he's a was an extremely arrogant 19th century German philosopher uh, who whose views I don't accept,
Mhm.
uh, but he introduced me to this methodology for doing philosophy, but also I think uh, for thinking about how humans form their beliefs more broadly.
Mm.
His idea was he was a critic, he came after Kant, who was sort of a central figure of the Enlightenment.
Mhm.
And he was a critic of the Enlightenment. If the Enlightenment had um, a motto, it would be think for yourself, right?
Mm.
Up until the Enlightenment, right, the church had this, at least in Western European uh, intellectual circles, had a stranglehold, right? The dogma had to be abided by, right? There
Mhm.
was this authority that needed to be conformed to in all your thinking, and the
Mm.
Enlightenment challenged that, right? The
Mm.
Enlightenment, and Hegel wasn't critical of that. Uh, but he thought that the Enlightenment went too far in the other direction.
Mm.
His idea was that all of us have, if you will, a worldview. He doesn't use that language, but a worldview through which we see the world, interpret our experience, make sense of things. Um, and the tradition that or traditions that the Enlightenment was rejecting were worldviews,
Mhm.
developed, right, refined
Mhm.
uh, worldviews that had evolved through through the centuries, um, as generation after generation inherited this worldview and thought about it critically,
Mhm.
and refined it. Um, and the Enlightenment comes along, and the Enlightenment says, "Think for yourself," but forgot that when they think for themselves, uh, in, say, challenging this inherited worldview, uh, they've got some kind of nascent worldview of their own that
Mhm.
they are doing that criticizing with,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And but the problem is that they're, at least for Hegel, the problem was that the Enlightenment thinkers weren't acknowledging this uh, worldview. And so they were being dogmatic,
Mm.
right? They were dogmatically assuming their worldview, which they didn't even know the contours of fully, in criticizing the previous
Yeah.
worldview.
Yeah.
And whatever worldview
Mm.
they had, Hegel thought, didn't have the advantage of having been passed on from one generation to another and refined in the light of the lived experience of communities, uh, generation after generation.
Mm.
And so he thought, in a certain sense, the Enlightenment was a kind of intellectual disaster.
Mm.
Um, I'm not sure I would go that far, but uh, but his question was, is there a way to avoid dogmatism?
Mm.
Right? He thought the Enlightenment didn't avoid dogmatism. He thought that they were right to criticize sort of dogmatic adoption of a pre-existing worldview. But is there a way to avoid it? And he thought, yes, there is. The way you avoid it is you consciously take on a worldview, but you take it on lightly, and you live it out critically.
Mm.
That
Almost like
is,
as a
you would,
test.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
you give it a test run, right?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
take it on, and um,
Mm.
and you try it out,
Mhm.
right? And then you pay attention to where it fails you,
Mhm.
right? And this is what he thought the predecessors of the Enlightenment, the dogmatic thinkers, went terribly wrong, was because they didn't pay attention to where it failed them. They patched over and covered up, right?
Yeah.
Often where it failed them. Instead of, you take on a worldview, you live it out critically with an eye towards where it fails, and then uh, you revise
Mhm.
where it fails you, to fix the problem, right? And then you continue, the journey, and you keep
Yeah.
on paying attention to where it goes wrong, um, fixing that, and then moving forward. So it's a kind of
Mm.
progressive approach, right? In the sense that you start with uh, a tradition.
Mhm.
Um, and I mean, he also was, of the view that you're not well equipped to non-dogmatically criticize uh, worldviews other than your own,
Mm.
right? So his, uh, his idea was, what the Enlightenment thinkers were doing was they were saying, look at them, not look at all what's wrong with them. Um, and um, uh, Well, dogmatically assuming their own perspective.
Mhm.
Um, but uh, that kind of external criticism is far less productive than internal criticism.
Mhm.
Um, if there is a use to external criticism, and this is not Hegel but me, it is useful for me to hear external criticism
Mhm.
uh, because that could help me in the internal project of refining
Yep.
my own perspective.
Mhm.
Um, but there's things that external critics don't get, right? They don't understand the worldview they're criticizing the way that someone who inhabits it does.
Yep.
Um,
Mm.
uh, and so they're going to get things wrong, right? Their criticisms
Mhm.
may miss something really crucial. So I'm not required to pay attention
Mhm.
to all of it, but I should take it seriously enough because because I'm in when I inhabit uh, a worldview, a perspective, or a tradition. Um, I live my life in accord with it. Um, there is a bias that I have towards it
Yep.
that's rooted in my human desire not to be wrong, not to have the rug pulled out from under me,
Mhm.
right? To avoid the idea that I've been living a lie, right?
I've
There's
never
all
felt
kinds of
that before,
reasons.
Eric.
Huh?
I've never felt that before.
Right, right. So there's all kinds of
Yeah.
reasons why I could be biased,
Yep.
you know, a- and and those biases may lead me to brush over and ignore imperfections in my worldview. So the external critic is useful in keeping me honest, right?
Yep. Yep.
Um, but may not. Uh, but I'm the more effective critic, right,
Yeah.
than the
Yeah.
external critic.
Mm.
Um, so uh, it was that methodological approach of Hegel. Now, of course, Hegel thought that humanity has been going through this method collectively, generationally,
Mhm.
even in spite of themselves,
Mm.
right? And have been making progress towards what he called the absolute. And he thought that he was the culmination of history, and his philosophy was the discovery of the absolute. I said he's an arrogant bastard, right?
Little bit.
And right, yeah. And I don't think he quite took his own methodology seriously enough in
Right.
that dimension, right? Um,
Practice
but
what you preach, man.
yeah, but his methodology I really took to heart,
Mhm.
and I it became for me the sort of model for my doing philosophy. And one
Mhm.
of the implications of taking that model seriously was that I couldn't cleanly separate my philosophical work from my personal faith journey, because it's in living out critically a faith tradition
Yeah.
that I get the insights uh, for uh, for my philosophy, and
Yeah.
so philosophy became sort of integral to my faith. Unsurprisingly, given my starting point,
Mhm.
but that starting point, took me initially on this journey into exploring something more like um, what my parents had rejected. But then I found my way um, eventually towards a an expression of my faith that uh, that included philosophy as this vital integral piece.
Yeah. Wow. What a story.
Yeah.
Wow.
Anyway.
That's amazing. No, I mean, there are so many things just listening to. I was writing down just thoughts I was having, but there's so many different things that I'd want to respond to. But just the thing that kind of comes to mind is especially that when you were talking later on in your story about Hegel and some of the things you learned from him. Um, and I'm not a philosopher, so I apologize. If you can tell me how this kind of fits into what you just described, but I feel like there's some kind of cohesion here. But one of the things I found in my journey is that like I grew up in a very evangelical world, very conservative, very fundamentalist, all specific doctrines you had to abide by, and kind of like
Mhm.
your mom had described, you eat this stuff and you throw it up and they jam it back in, like you have to believe this. That's
Right.
I felt that a lot. But one of the things I've come to realize in my own faith journey now is that arguments, philosophical, intellectual arguments alone don't do very much to help people see things differently, right?
Yeah.
Like I
Right.
even think of like myself, back when I was in college, I was in seminary in regards to, for instance, like the conversation about LGBTQ people. I had
Mhm.
my 6 Bible verses memorized. I could weaponize those things better than anybody that I knew. I could win
Mhm.
any argument that you put in front of me. I would just keep going until you got exhausted and you just gave up. Kind of walked
Mhm.
away, because there was like no argument, there was no idea, there was no new interpretation, no matter how well it was crafted, that was going to change my mind. But then I left my job as a pastor. I've told this on the podcast before, but I want to share it with you. I left my job as a pastor and I went to work for Apple, an Apple
Mhm.
store for 11 years. And I worked in a store. My first store had 150 people in it. And so now I'm like way out of my church bubble. The bubble's been
Right.
burst.
Yeah.
And, I'm working with all different sorts of people from all these different backgrounds, like you said about the rainbow, like all different colors of the rainbow.
Mhm.
And I work with a lot of people. I worked with a lot of people who are gay,
Mhm.
lesbian, trans, and I saw their stories. I saw them laugh, I saw them cry. I saw how much they loved and how much they cared, and how
Mhm.
different they were from what I was told they were going to be like. Because I was
Right.
told like
Yeah.
these people are obsessed with sex and they're pedophiles, all these different horrible, horrible
Right.
things.
Right. Yeah.
And when my experience at Apple didn't line up with what I was taught growing up, I had this like explosion in my head, and like all of a sudden my feelings began to change. Like intellectually I didn't know what to do with those 6 verses. Still I didn't understand what to do with them, but my heart began to really soften towards these
Mhm.
people. And I said to my wife, a huge moment in my faith, I said to my wife, I said, like, if the Bible really teaches that like God is like extra angry at gay people, like I think the Bible has to be wrong, because I feel
Mhm.
like what I've been taught is not lining up with my experience. And so I always say that like proximity breeds empathy, right? Like new
Mhm.
philosophical ideas, new
Mhm.
arguments, new things, like that's not gonna always gonna change the way that you think as much as an experience will. And I think that a lot of that
Yeah.
even goes into like social media stuff, and why like I find it so pointless these days to argue on social media is because all these ideas that people have, it's like we're just typing our ideas, we're typing our thoughts, we're typing these different things, and they're divorced from the experience because we're just kind of crafting these intellectual arguments. And so
Right.
anyway, everything you were just talking about, just about seeing things from a different perspective, like, for a long time, I tried on, for instance, like, to use that language, I tried on the belief, that, like, LGBTQ people make God extra angry. And then
Mhm.
when I got to Apple, I started to see all the ways that didn't really fit anymore. And so I
Right.
was like, I really gotta rethink this because it doesn't really fit the way that I thought it would fit. And so now I'm in this place where I've rethought through some of those different verses, and I've rethought through my thoughts on those things. I've come to a much different place. I still wear the clothing of a Christian, so to speak, but
Yeah.
that particular piece of the garment doesn't fit the way that it used to, and so I've had to exchange it for something different. So while you were
Right.
talking, that's like the biggest thing that was coming to my head, and I think there's like an alignment there with what we're saying.
Yeah. No, exactly. I don't think um, philosophy abstracted from human experience uh, uh, doesn't do much, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, but once you try on a particular worldview and you um, through lived experience encounter what Hegel called contradictions, right?
Yes, yeah.
Places where the worldview crashes up against reality and
Mhm,
cracks, right?
mhm.
Uh, then um, you need tools to process that, right? And
Yeah.
that's for me where philosophical argument and reflection is most valuable, right?
Yeah.
Um, what must I um, what must I give up in the face of this contradiction? What uh, needn't I give up?
Hmm.
Right? Um, um, what modification to my worldview will accommodate reality, and at what point, um, right? Sometimes there are these Copernican shifts, right, in our
Hmm.
worldviews, right,
Hmm.
where everything changes, right?
Yeah.
For a long time, the Helios, the Earth-centered picture of the cosmos made a lot of sense, and um, as there were celestial observations that didn't quite fit uh, uh, the this Earth-centered picture would be modified with uh, spheres within spheres moving in different ways. Um, and then finally, this got so complex, right, with all these
Hmm.
spheres moving in all these different ways. And then um, Copernicus comes along and says, if we just change this one fundamental assumption, uh, assume that the Earth is not the center, but the sun is, and the Earth is moving, uh, everything is simplified, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and we can explain all of these observations, right, from in a much more elegant way, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes that happens, right,
Hmm.
and there are these Copernican shifts in our worldview, um, and um, of course, that's frightening to someone, a sort of traditional person of faith who thinks that this is the rock, right? This belief system is the foundation of a good life,
Yeah.
and they've invested themselves in that. The idea that there could be a Copernican shift,
Yeah.
right, uh, that turns everything upside down is extremely frightening.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm.
by and large, um, uh, the kinds of discoveries we make in our lives don't call for a Copernican shift. Um, and there's at least some evidence that um, that uh, these divergent worldviews um, uh, are evolving gradually towards a shared truth.
Mhm.
Um, Maybe some are closer at one time than another, and that sort of thing. Um, and maybe there's a Copernican shift waiting, right? Uh, at for each of us eventually.
Yeah.
But for me, the the thing that sort of got me to be really comfortable with the prospect of a Copernican shift potentially happening
Mhm.
uh, is um, uh, something within the Christian tradition itself that says we are to worship God, not an idol.
Mhm.
And what that means is that our devotion has to be to the truth about God, not to our beliefs about God.
Mhm.
If our devotion is to our beliefs about God, we're worshiping an idol.
Mhm.
And so once my devotion is to the truth about God, whatever that is, even if it should turn out to be fundamentally unlike what I think it is right now.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't have any sort of profound reason to think that it's completely, wrong.
Mhm.
Uh, but it, but if my devotion is the truth rather than my beliefs, then I have to be willing to risk not only having experiences that require me to change something, to refine something, uh, but to risk the possibility of a Copernican shift.
Yeah. Yeah. And also causes you too to be comfortable with risking that your change might need to change, right?
Yeah,
Because you
right,
might have grown up like in this one tradition, rethought things, and now you're in this place. But now, if your allegiance is to the truth, like you said, then what you changed your mind to might have to change again as you
right.
maybe peel back another layer of the truth and see things even more
Yep,
differently. And I feel like now
yep,
I'm in this place where I've rethought so many aspects of my evangelical upbringing, and I've come to these different places, but now I'm even realizing that those different places are being rethought, because now I'm even rethinking things that I rethought 3 years ago that I rethought 2 years before that. It's like it's rethinking again. So like for that, like that word deconstruction is like the buzzword. And I feel like
right.
it's just a constant process of rethinking things until you come to a deeper layer of the onion of that truth. And I think that for
Yeah,
me, that's been such a more freeing journey as opposed to that dogmatic journey of I'm just gonna
right.
white knuckle every single belief. Like the LGBTQ thing, I could have said these experiences are bogus. These are my
Right.
beliefs. Forget it. I'm gonna hold on to it. But like this part of my journey that I'm in now, it's much more exciting in my journey with the divine than it was
Yeah.
previously. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, Another thing, element of Hegel
Hmm.
that connects with what you were saying is that I mean he sort of saw the development of our worldviews um, as an ascending spiral almost.
Mm.
There was and what he models in the phenomenology of spirit has that form that each new sort of uh, formulation of the perspective that emerges out of the uh, critical living out of the previous version bears some resemblance to something that has come before,
Mm.
right? And you sort of spiral around, right? And you're now at a worldview that is actually quite similar to one you left behind, but it's not the same, right?
Yeah.
It's more profound. It's closer to the truth. It's a next higher layer in the spiral, if you will.
That's right. That's right.
So,
Well, Eric, we are just about out of time, my friend. But
mhm.
this has been. I could talk to you all day because I have so many things from your story that I wrote down. So maybe we could do this again sometime because I have more questions
Yeah,
I'd like to ask you.
sure.
Awesome.
Happy
Well,
to.
thank you for your time. And where can people go to interact with you? Maybe online, or do you have any kind of website you want to point us to?
Yeah, so I have uh, a web page blog, "The Piety That Lies Between."
Hmm.
Um, if you Google that, you'll find it. And I don't maintain it as much as I used to. It used to be um, that people were much more engaged with blogs than they are today. And
Okay.
I found, but I mean, all my books, you can find links to all my books there. And you can search lots of things that I, posted over the years on a variety of topics, just my thinking about different things. Um, and uh, I found that I get more response when I, post things on social media. But now I'm like sort of jaded with social media. Still, you can find
I can't
you
imagine
can find
why.
me on Facebook.
Yeah.
If you uh, uh, you can follow me on Facebook, and a lot of what I post is public facing. Uh, when I post pictures of personal nature, I it's private. You wouldn't
Hmm.
see that if you're
Sure.
just following. But um, those are, and then so Eden Sancti Grief has a book page, and I have an author page on Amazon where
Hmm.
there you can see my other books. So,
Awesome. I'll put the links in the show notes and we'll do it again soon.
all right, thank
Thanks, my
you,
friend.
appreciate it.